Thanks very much, Sydney. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Panorama Project's Immersive Media and Books 2020 webinar. My name is Dan Albone, and I lead the project. Today's event is a major milestone, not only for the Panorama Project and the publishing program at Portland State University, but also for our entire industry. The Immersive Media and Books report, undertaken amidst the pandemic and in a most rancorous year, is the culmination of many months of consumer research, extensive data analysis, and rigorous writing by our authors, Dr. Rachel Noorda and Dr. Kathi Inman Berens. True to Panorama's mission to deliver data-informed insights, this report is indeed rich with data, including graphs and tables and charts to illustrate provocative findings that are certain to stimulate discourse between and among publishers, authors, librarians, booksellers, vendors serving our industry, advocacy groups, association, and the media, all of whom are represented in our gathering today. And thank you for joining us. I'd also like to thank OverDrive, the Book Industry Study Group, the American Library Association, and the Independent Book Publishers Association for their financial support, without which an undertaking like this could not have happened. I'd like to call your attention to a couple poll questions on your screen. They'll appear for only a few minutes. We ask that you complete those. We'd like to know who you are, where you're from, and the organizations you represent. And following the presentation, we will look forward to entertaining questions. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce the authors of Immersive Media and Books 2020, Dr. Rachel Noorda and Dr. Kathi Inman Berens of Portland State University. Rachel is director of the Book Publishing Graduate Program and assistant professor of English, and Kathi, who recently attained tenure, is associate professor of publishing and digital humanities. Good morning, Kathi and Rachel.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dan. Thank you. It's so good to see all of the attendees here and from all over the US and all over the world, it looks like from the chat. Thanks for being here. We are excited to share with you today the findings of the Immersive Media and Books 2020 study and report. This is a project unlike other projects in the book industry. And this is because it is a cross-industry, cross-media, publicly accessible report with objective third-party analysis and capturing data both about behavior before and during COVID. The cross-industry perspective comes from our research committee, which I'll talk more about in a minute. And they represent organizations across the industry so that we can address the needs and issues that are facing not only libraries, but also publishers, authors, readers, and booksellers. This is also a cross-media study. So not just thinking about books and book consumption, but how it fits within a media ecosystem. And that includes primarily thinking about TV, film, and also games, and how book discovery and consumption inform each other. This is also a publicly accessible report. If you haven't had the chance to read the report, either the full 75-page version or the short version that's 5 pages, please do so. We know that the industry is full of proprietary data, and this provides a challenge because it means often we don't have a foundation for all of us to talk about the industry from the same place. Because we're not privy to the same data in talking and making decisions. So having this report publicly accessible was very important. And this is made possible by the funders of this project, as Dan mentioned. And then the third party analysis comes from myself and my colleague here today, Kathi Berens, from Portland State University. We bring an academic perspective and are thinking about these various industry stakeholders. This is also a study in which we were capturing data about behavior, not only during COVID, but also before COVID. And this is a unique time, as you know, for book consumption. So this is important. The goal of the project is twofold: to establish books' place in the larger ecosystem by gaining insight into consumer behavior. So that includes also our second goal, thinking about how public libraries fit within the ecosystem. These are the two goals that have been driving this study.
Yes. So here we are seeing some of our top level findings. You'll note that we are talking here about book engagement and not book reading and not even book consumption, because we're also trying to capture the behavior of people who give books to other people but don't read them themselves, or even pirates who steal books. So our definition of engagement is buying, borrowing, subscribing to, reading or gifting a printed book, an ebook, or audiobook in part or in whole. There was a Pew study that found that 75% of Americans had engaged with a book within a 12-month period. And we used that criterion as a screening question. So the results you'll be seeing here today are only representing people who have engaged with a book, that meeting that definition of engagement, within the last 12 months. But because we're asking about engagement and not just reading, we expect that our data captures a wider portion of the US population than just the 75% who had read a book within the previous 12 months.
Yes, and what's interesting about these this engagement, so Avid book engagers make up 53%. These are people engaging with 4 or more books per month. And a greater proportion of them than the general survey population are Black and Latinx millennials. And so this is an interesting group for the industry to watch.
And we'll be saying more about that in our section on audience.
1 in 3 people bought a book in a bookstore that they first found in a library. And so we are noting, of course, some of the ways in which libraries are part of discovery within this process. And 75% of the respondents of the survey are library card holders.
So genre is the most important driver of discovery. And one reason we think this is the case, is that genre is a way of de-risking selection, that you have an idea of what to expect when you choose within genre. And we think that's why genre is the most important driver of discovery.
Yeah. In terms of the how and where of discovery too, we're going to talk more about word of mouth, which was an important piece, and browsing and in-person events as well for that where piece.
And finally, the last headline is that 75% of our respondents are library card holders. And we'll be talking about various demographics. And our report has library card possession broken down by demographic and US region. So go check that out in the full report.
One of the benefits of this report is the input that the survey design and the survey questions received from the input of the research committee. So we'd like to give a shout out to them. They represent multiple stakeholders and areas of the industry. Obviously Panorama Project and Dan, who is here, and Guy, who founded the project at Panorama initially, Angela from the Independent Book Publishers Association, Michelle from PubWest, Alan from the American Library Association, and also Brian from the Book Industry Study Group. Their input was instrumental in representing the interests and concerns of publishers, authors, libraries, readers, and also booksellers.
And we put our survey questions through drafts, based on input from these committee members.
We had a robust methodology for this survey data and a large sample size, 4,314 responses and a margin of error of 1.5%. The survey respondents were pre-qualified through the reputable data and research company Qualtrics. And there were quotas for age, race, gender, and region that were implemented in the sample to ensure representativeness. All respondents, as Kathi mentioned, answered yes to a screening question about reading at least one book in the last 12 months. All right, so we are going to focus on this webinar in two main areas, and that is discovery and audience. These, of course, align with the goals of the project to think about how books fit within the media ecosystem and how libraries also fit within that ecosystem. So for discovery, we're going to talk about context, cross-media, libraries, and also piracy as part of that. All right, for discovery, word of mouth was highly important, as may not come as a huge surprise. When asked to pick one top preferred method of book discovery, the number one was recommendation from friends, followed by favorite author, recommendations from family, and recommendations on social media. What is interesting about these four top picks of discovery, though, is they are still highly distributed. So even this top recommendations from friends only accounts for 1/5 of respondents. In other words, preference for book discovery methods is highly dispersed. And so that's good news. It means there are many ways to reach audiences, and it's dependent on more granular data about the target audience and the book's niche.
And you'll see in our full report that we have two different charts representing this information. People were asked to select all of the modes of discovery that influenced them, and then they were asked to select the top method of discovery. And actually, there was a correlation between those two things. So in fact, these rankings overlap in both of those cases. But what's really interesting is that you'll see in the full report, we have about 15 or so different modes of discovery that people could choose from. I was really surprised that only 3% of the surveyed people said that algorithms are their preferred method of discovery. And given, as you'll see soon, how important online browsing is to people, we were kind of wondering if people are fully aware of the extent to which algorithms are driving their awareness. So in other words, it might be quite possible that people get a recommendation from a friend, and that's the thing that tips them. But prior to that, they may have seen it recommended by an influencer in social media, or they might have read a review, or when they were shopping elsewhere, they might have seen an ad. So there are any number of exposures that are algorithmically driven that they might not really be aware of.
Yeah, this is another piece that warrants further study because word of mouth doesn't come from nowhere. So even beyond just thinking about algorithms and people's awareness of algorithms in influencing their behavior, there's also, even for these pieces of word of mouth, where did the friend who recommended the book, where did they initially hear about the book, for example? And so getting some more granular data about those pieces, of which, to be honest, often consumers are not really aware, can be a bit tricky, especially for a consumer survey, but it's something that would be, great data to complement the things that we have here, and would be great for future research to provide. Additionally, and we'll talk more about this, but author is something that comes up quite often in the survey. So here you see that number 2 is favorite author in terms of how people prefer to discover books, but it's also something that comes up in terms of author events being quite important for where people are finding books, and also an important factor in book purchase. So this author brand piece is something that that keeps occurring and that we'll come to again and again.
Yes. For example, we have here the browsing and in-person experience were ranked as important. Remember that we were capturing data about behavior before COVID and during COVID. So we have data in the full report, you'll see about people discussing in-person author events and also virtual author events. Of course, one of the advantages of virtual events is that, and as we're seeing today, anyone from all around the world can come to your virtual event. And yet there's a tremendous amount of enthusiasm for in-person author events, coming in in third place with 13.3%. So a question for further study, and we are hoping that this study will be longitudinal to provide the industry with a bedrock of data going forward. Will in-person events like festivals resume being an engine of discovery post-COVID? I know that it is, I'm an advisor for the Portland Book Festival, and I know that selling books at an in-person event is, it's tremendously active. In fact, I have data about that because we did a survey in 2019 to specifically investigate the role of live co-presence and getting to meet that author and getting your book signed, how those things influence both discovery and loyalty. But the question is, have habits changed? Are people going to feel comfortable going to live events and being co-present with hundreds or thousands of other people? So that's an interesting question that will be exciting to track as time passes.
Yeah, in addition to the in-person piece that we see in some of these top where of discovery, is also browsing. That browsing is happening in online bookstores, brick and mortar, and also shelves in libraries. And so those two pieces are both highlighted in these top choices of where people are discovering books. Related also to the where of discovery for books is an exciting finding from the data that that actually bookstores are not just showrooms for Amazon, which is something that has been talked about in the industry previously, but actually about equal percentages of respondents were finding books online and then buying it in a bookstore, as were doing the opposite, finding books in a bookstore and then going and buying it online. So really this gets at what we call in the report context agnostic discovery. In other words, people are finding books in many places and then buying it in another place. That there's a lot of movement from place to place in terms of discovery and purchase and where those things are happening.
And so one of the things this suggests, and we'll be talking about it on a slide further down the deck, is that price is not the only or not the primary driver in people's consideration sets, that being in a physical bookstore yields all other kinds of benefits that really actually merit further discovery. If people are willing to pay full price for a book, which we can see that they are willing to do, why? What is it specifically about that live physical presence in your local neighborhood store? Is it recommendations from booksellers, as we know is really important in the northeastern region of the United States? Is it about supporting one's local community? Is it about the type of books that are offered at local bookstores? We do need to gather more information about what is so alluring about a local bookstore compared to the sort of infinite possibility of Amazon and other online vendors.
That's a great segue actually into this slide, because price is something to talk about here. This brings us also back to the author. As we mentioned, the author, we come back to again and again, and the author brand. So the top, there was a question about most important factors for book purchase. And genre was number one, but author number two, and reviews number three. And what's also interesting is that price was less significant, didn't make it into the top categories in that way when people were asked to name their top preferred, their most important factor for making that book purchasing decision.
However, I will note that there is a subpopulation for whom price is the primary consideration. Those people are pirates, and there are also people who are very attracted to book giveaways and other forms of free content. So price is, for the general population, price is a less significant factor for book purchase. However, for a subset of our survey respondents, price was the most important factor, and we'll be talking about that further in the presentation.
Women were also more sensitive to price too. That was a more important factor for them than it was for men, for example.
Do you folks mind if I bump this aside for just a moment and ask some of the great questions that we're getting from the audience? I think some of them are really timely and might really add to the conversation you're having presently. Okay, great. So we have a few that are speaking specifically to the sections that you've gone over so far. Apologies for looking off screen. That's where I've written them down. The first one is, did librarian or library worker as a role come up in the survey for recommendation?
Yes, we had, so in terms of discovery, there was an option about like recommendations from librarians. It was quite low, to be honest, 2-ish%, I think it was 2.4%. So that was, sorry.
In the Midwest, except in the Midwest.
Yes, as you look into the granular data, there are certain populations like the Midwest where that's higher. But rather low. Same thing for booksellers, where recommendations from booksellers is also quite low for the general population.
Similarly, do you have the data to indicate if preferred method of discovery is also the method most likely leading to a purchase?
Hard to tell, but we did have separate questions about that. So, I mean, the data in our study is not meant to capture just book buying. So we wanted to know also, is this driving people to discover books to go borrow it in a library in which they're not seeing that, as a purchasing decision because they are accessing the book for free. But as you can see, like, from the slide that's up just now, there was a question about the most important factors for book purchase. So it wasn't necessarily about what was leading them to discovery, but we do have some data about what is going into that purchasing decision.
Yes.
In the 30% browsing online discovery, a participant asked, is that multi-platform or are people fairly platform specific?
Unfortunately, we don't know. So in parentheses, we included, that could be Amazon, that could be bookshop.org, that could be a website for your individual, local bookshop. So it wasn't intentionally broad, but it means, again, that would be a really great further study piece. Now that we see, how large and how important a piece that is, it would be great to know, okay, as a follow-up question, where exactly are you going for that online discovery?
Sure.
And it would be interesting also to ask questions specifically about self-published authors. Like, where are people finding self-pub books? Are they finding them through consortia? Are they finding them through newsletters? Some local libraries actually gather self-published books. So I think it would be great to collect some data specifically around how people find books authored that are self-published.
Oh yeah, that's fascinating. I'm going to ask one more that I think is great for the whole session, and then I'm going to hold the rest until a little bit later on, and that is, are we providing at some point a link to both the short and long version of the report for participants to view?
Yes.
I thought so. I just wanted to hear it from
That's available right now. If you want to multitask, you can go over to panoramaproject.org and you will find a link to the full report, including appendices with all the survey questions, every chart, and a short version that kind of hits all these big highlights. Thank you, Patsy, for linking to Panorama Project. So yeah, that's available right this very minute.
Thank you both so much. I'm going to go off camera and let you continue, and I'll break in a little bit later with more great questions.
Thank you, Sydney.
Thanks, Sydney. So another thing to know about this particular question is that, and especially about author and the importance of author, is that it does differ when we look at our subsections, our cross sections. So, for example, author events are of more importance for discovery for men, for millennials, and for Black and Latinx respondents. So this is, again, a call for you as you're thinking about particular markets and particular book projects to look at that granular data in the report, because those differences amongst groups can help to create, target campaigns based on the ways that these audiences are finding books.
And it's also, finally, it's also really interesting to note that front cover is only about 4% of something that would drive people's interest in a book, even though we believe that book covers are actually much more important in a marketing campaign than that. But it just goes to show that what people assess as being important to them, that there's a whole infrastructure of book industry marketing that isn't fully visible to ordinary consumers.
One thing that I would like to do more research on for the future would be on this book cover piece, because one thing that we did see was that participants, BIPOC participants, respondents, and also non-binary respondents rated front cover as more important to their book purchasing decision than other respondents. And so, digging more into that, into why the visibility maybe of seeing themselves when they don't usually see themselves on the cover is important to them, is maybe a conversation that we should be having as an industry. But that's
totally. And just to clarify, that BIPOC means Black and Indigenous people of color. So just make sure folks know what that means. Yeah.
So discovery is also happening cross-media, and that's why we were very excited to have a study that looked not just at books, but how books are intersecting and how consumption is intersecting with other media. So you can see from these bullet points here, how engagement with one form leads to discovery of something in another form. For example, engaging with a book, 60% of our respondents then are finding TV, film, or games from that. Or engaging with a TV series, 61% are then finding a new book or game. Game then leading to something else is the smallest of the categories, only 33% going from game and then leading to book, TV series, or film. But you can see how this is a very circular discovery sort of process.
Yeah, and one finding that was really interesting is that millennial avid book engagers are also the most active across other media. And so it becomes this question of, where do they find the time? And, speaking with my graduate students about it, who are millennials, they were talking about reading books in interstitial moments. One student talked about reading a book while watching a hockey game, and when it's time out, she picks up her book. Or others were talking about watching a movie with parents and not really wanting to watch that movie, so reading a book instead. So it's interesting to think about how fluidly people are moving between different media environments.
Yeah, absolutely. And essentially, I think at the crux of this is thinking about cross-media as informing each other and discovery across, rather than cannibalizing sales or competing for consumers, but actually the most avid consumers of books are also the most avid consumers of TV, movies, and also games. So encouraging sales in other media forms.
Yeah.
One of the goals of the project, as we've noted, was to think about the role of libraries in the media ecosystem. And so in pursuit of this goal, we found that 75.8% of respondents are library card holders. Older respondents had higher proportions of library card holders than younger ones, so baby boomers being the highest. And we found that library borrowing does not necessarily preclude or discourage respondents from buying books. So, for example, a greater percentage of library card holders said that they were buying more books during COVID than the general population, and that was across every format, so ebook, audiobook, and print. And then also in thinking about context agnostic and discovery, one place leading to buying or borrowing in another place, about a third of respondents bought a book online that they first found in a library. And similarly, about a third of respondents bought a book in a bookstore that they first found in a library. So this demonstrates that library discovery is leading to book purchase in these cases.
Yes. So this slide is pretty self-evident, so we're not going to spend too much time on it. You can see that when the book is unavailable from the library, the first option is to put oneself on a hold list, but then also to buy it from an online bookstore or buy it from a local bookstore. So library card holders are pretty active in hunting down the books they want when they want them.
Yes, library unavailability can lead some respondents to go elsewhere and purchase the book rather than wait for it.
Yes.
And then our last piece of discovery before we move to audience is about piracy. This was a really interesting part of the data because the data shows that book pirates don't just steal books, they also buy books, they are subscribing to books, and they're borrowing books. Some pirates are turning to piracy when a book is unavailable from the library, or when it's not accessible. But they are also buying in multiple formats, 41%, for example.
Yeah, and book pirates are also, paying for subscriptions to games and paying for subscriptions to newspapers and magazines. So in a way, we have to kind of figure out what's the value proposition. Like for a person who is as price sensitive as a book pirate, what's the value add of subscribing to whatever services they subscribe to. So we definitely need more discovery. Talking to book pirates, you'll see that pirates discover more through cross media than the general population, and you can see those charts in our report, and you can see the data in front of you. But there's quite a lot of cross media discovery for pirates in particular. So one thing to think a little bit about is to situate piracy on a continuum of behavior rather than as an absolute. You're a thief or you're not a thief is the absolute. But instead thinking about piracy alongside things like BookBub, which is an author marketing platform that offers readers books for free or at a very steep discount. I mean, on their website right now, they're advertising a 95% discount via legitimate vendors like Kindle, Apple Books, and Nook. So obviously, this is a legitimate site and they are buying, or they're just offering up their data in exchange for free books. So the problem with pirates is their real piratical gesture is that they are evading giving any information. So it's an asymmetrical power relationship. But if authors can, through book giveaways or other forms of free enticement, develop a relationship with pirates, pirates might be converted into customers.
Absolutely. All right, so now we'll talk about audience, especially in rethinking target audiences in the book industry, especially Black and Latinx and millennial audiences. So avid book engagers, those who engage 4 or more books per month, were one of the segments that we looked at. And we saw 2 pieces of data that we had to reconcile. One was that we knew that there was a surge in sales in 2020, 8.2% rise, biggest jump in a decade. And yet also most of the respondents in the survey said that their book buying stayed the same during COVID. So how do we reconcile this? Well, it's a group of rather avid engagers that is driving this, this rise in sales. And so this is the group that we talk a lot about in the report. And what's also interesting about this group is that they are more ethnically diverse and younger than we see in the rest of the general survey population. So, for example, 67% of Black respondents are avid book engagers, 59% of Latinx respondents. In comparison, only 50% of white respondents are avid book engagers. And so this is really exciting data to show how these groups are engaging with books and how frequently they are engaging with books.
And how they could be better served, which is something we'll talk about toward the end.
Yeah, that's certainly a call to action, something that we all need to think more about. And related to that, because millennials were also a greater proportion of the avid book engagers than they were of the general survey population, but millennials are also more ethnically diverse than other age categories. And this trend of more ethnically diverse millennials actually is something that the US population in general is experiencing. So white Americans are older than other racial groups in America. And the census population projects that over 50% of the US population will be non-white by 2045, for example. So yeah, it's exciting and good to kind of contextualize that.
And then our survey also discovered some very interesting data about multitasking. The headline here is to watch millennials for next generation behaviors. So in the general population, 70% of the people listening to audiobooks are also doing something else at the same time. 61% for ebooks, 37% for print books, and so forth. I'll let you read that on your own. But what's interesting is that millennials are multitasking across all media. 53% of them are multitasking while reading print books, which really is a very different notion of attention and immersion than we typically associate with that form factor. Millennials outconsume baby boomers with print at a rate of almost 2 to 1, as you'll see on that previous slide, if you go back and look at our slides. For millennials, mobile computing facilitates multitasking. We know that this population is the most active with their mobile devices, and it facilitates moving between media. It promotes what I call a grazing behavior, where they're taking in lots and lots. They're basically doing risk-free product sampling across all different media. Think about the 187 million people who use Spotify for free or ad-supported Spotify, people who pay $7 a month for Netflix and then have access to 18 million pieces of content. So people are grazing until they find a thing they really like, and then they go deep. We can extrapolate what this means for Gen Z, and our report specifically calls out Gen Z behavior on pages 17 to 19. So you can check out that. Baby boomers, by contrast, multitask the least of any age group, except with audiobooks. By large margins, they have the least cross-media discovery. And now our conclusions.
Yes.
So books are one part of a media entertainment ecosystem. And as we've talked about, avid book engagers consume more TV, movies, and video games than the survey population. Mobile computing is a key factor in higher rates of media consumption.
Millennial book engagers, particularly Black and Latinx, are the category to watch. And genre is the most important consideration factor when people are deciding whether or not to engage with a book, and author coming second to that. So author brand is very important too.
Book pirate behavior warrants further study, and working with libraries is a win-win. It's not a zero-sum game, and the more collaboration between publishers, authors, and libraries, the more the audience is likely to grow. So here are some pain points or problem solving for the future that we might want to chat about. There's a conflict between how millennials and Gen Z find content, that is through streaming services, and the very low royalty payments to artists. Jane Friedman reports that 180,000 streams are equivalent to 1 month of a minimum wage salary. That's data from Songtrust. The problem is that revenue does not grow with consumption. It grows with subscription or ads. And so when we think about how the youngest readers and book engagers are finding their books, we do have to reckon with their media habits, which can be subscription-based. When we think about how to grow an audience, we do want to think about how to convert people who seek free content. We need to think strategically about giveaways and piracy, particularly for millennials and Gen Z. We need more discovery about these. There are price-driven readers, and what specific circumstances have incentivized them to buy or lease access to products, because we do know they open their wallets. They've told us that they do. We just need to know what motivates that action. And then finally, how can the industry better serve Black and Latinx book engagers? For example, there's a fantastic article by Laura McGrath called Comping White, which talks about the structural changes of the acquisitions, or the structural features of the acquisitions process, and the phenomenon, the real difficulty of selling books by Black authors because there's a dearth of, because Black authors can be siloed into African-American fiction, whether or not their books are about African-American people or African-American experience.
Yes, and this study is meant to be part of a larger piece of data of an annual survey so that we can contextualize some of the things that we're finding this year. So, you know, we have many further questions to explore about how the things that we're seeing now with COVID, for example, will they persist? Are they permanent habits or not? And also the things that we're learning about libraries and more questions that we could ask about them. Why are millennials the most avid book engagers, but have the lowest rate of library card ownership, for example?
How to track the long tail of discovery. So we know that people are finding authors through the library. This came up in the questions that you guys posed to us, which is, you know, how does that discovery manifest? Is it like, are people finding something at the library and going off and purchasing? Well, we'll need to ask some questions about that.
And then there are many more questions we could ask about book piracy, because this was a surprising piece of data, and we'd like to know more about what motivates them to pirate and what could motivate them to turn that into a book purchase. So these are all things that we hope to, you know, further explore. And so finally, we'd just like to give another thank you to the funders of this project, ALA, BISG, IBPA, and OverDrive. And we look forward to answering some more questions.
Yes.
Great. Thanks so much. That is an incredible resource that folks have. And again, if you couldn't see it in the chat, we'll be sure to follow up with the web address where you can read both the long and short version of the survey to get more information. Now, someone in particular just asked about the article that you were referring to, the copyright article. Is that something that you could perhaps link to or talk a little bit more about so that folks would be able to
I can pop it into the
that?
chat. Yeah,
That's wonderful.
Sure. Yeah, you bet.
Yeah. Right. It looks like a couple folks might have found it. If it's the LA Review of Books article, then I think a couple folks have found it. I think just
that's it.
That is
sure.
Correct.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much, folks who both in the chat and the Q&A put that in there. All right. So we had a number of questions that I started to tackle, but I realized we might be looking at a larger scope question here, which is that is there a specific way that we can choose to define what makes a book pirate? I think most people are understanding the term piracy, but I think for this specific report, how did you find them? How did you define them for this particular research and more? If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, go ahead, Rach. Why don't you go first?
Yes, I was just going to pull up the exact wording of the question. But we did ask a question about the ways in which that people engage with books. And one of the options was engaging with books for free that should be paid for. So this was different from, say, accessing public domain books, whether ebooks or audiobooks, or borrowing from friends, borrowing from free little libraries. So we tried to make it very clear, this isn't a book that you got for a marketing promotion. You know, this is clear that like this is something that you know should be a book that you pay for, but that you got for free on a site where somebody, you know, uploaded that copy.
Great. Yeah, some of the surrounding questions, folks had a lot of interest in the piracy piece. So there were questions about, you know, was there some sample data about the age breakdown? Was there a percentage of the sample that you could identify specifically as book pirates? So some great questions about not only how did you get this data from the question itself, but was there any further information you could glean from the results you received?
Absolutely, we have that data. Sydney, maybe what would be great is if you could send us those questions and we can maybe follow up with the webinar, because we do have that data. I don't have those right at my fingertips right now, but yeah, we can share.
Yeah, that sounds great. Actually, Oh, that's wonderful. I think people are really going to be excited to see how broken down that information is. And in fact, I wanted to say kind of a blanket. I think we've had so many great questions. We've actually had dozens and dozens of questions. Some folks asking in chat, some folks asking in Q&A, which is absolutely fine. We're able to gather both. And what we plan to do is kind of sift through it, figure out kind of what our most frequently asked questions are, and then post it on the site. Again, to reiterate for those folks who asked if a reporting was coming, yes, we're not sending it out individually just because we'd really like to be able to track that data and ensure that we're able to offer more programs like this in the future. So it really helps us to know what the interest is by folks going to one place to see it. So we'll have that recording available shortly on the Panorama Project website, and that's also where we'll put that compilation of those frequently asked questions. So if we don't get to your question today, because we still do have one more poll and a couple I'd like to ask live, rest assured that if it's a common question, we're going to answer it in that frequently asked questions as well. So
and one thing to note about the report's design is that we did break it into concerns particular to various stakeholders, such as publishers, authors, readers, librarians. So people will even be able to go to a section that pertains particularly to them and get that deep dive.
That's great. That's wonderful. So some of the questions, of course, were around who the folks were that you got the information from. So one of the ones I think is interesting. I don't know how granular you'll be able to get with this, but did you index price sensitivity to demographics and/or income levels?
We didn't capture data about income levels.
And does the data vary between adult and children's book discovery? So an audience-based question.
The only way we could capture data about children's books would be talking to parents. The ethical standards of doing the survey prohibit us from asking questions to people under age 18.
Gotcha. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
However,
so we do have some questions about genre and asked about children's books and particular subgenres. I will say of all so we asked, about adult fiction, adult nonfiction, YA fiction, YA nonfiction, and then children's. Children's was the lowest category. Book gifters and women were the ones who engaged with children's the most. Sure. But lowest, I imagine that would be much higher if we weren't just talking to people who were 18 or older. But sure, that goes back to what Kathi was saying about ethical considerations.
So I will say that the report's call out about Gen Z is worth looking at. Gen Z makes up about 20% of the US population, and their information is folded into our millennial category of 18 to 34. But we did crunch some specific numbers. I mean, in a way, some of the trends that you might natively associate with millennials are exaggerated with Gen Z, such as being more influenced by social media influencers, sure, like responding more to diverse representation on book covers and things like that.
Yeah, actually, one of the folks just put in chat that TikTok is becoming a discovery vehicle for tweens and teens, which I think is a really, I mean, that's I've heard about some of my best reads from that recently, so I think that's becoming more popular. And then one of our participants in the Q&A asked the question that was foremost on my mind, which is, to you, what was the most surprising outcome from the study?
For me personally, it was about book pirates, because prior to this study, I only saw them in this fairly absolute way. And as I've been thinking about it, I realized, that in the time that it would take Rachel to read a slide, I could teach myself how to pirate a book. There is no technical, there is no technical barrier to pirating, and that's the problem. Like, I would imagine that back in the day, it required a bit of sophistication, perhaps some code capacity, but a pirate could be anybody going to a website, pressing a button, and you're done. And I think that's a real feature of our industry to investigate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Book piracy, and I guess I don't know if I was as surprised about it as excited about it, but the Black and Latinx millennials being avid book engagers was a really exciting piece for us. And we were excited to have data about that.
That's great.
Because we've had graduate students who've written about this. You know, we run a master's program in book publishing, and we had a student last year who wrote about diverse science fiction fantasy readers and why it's so hard to gather data about them. Here's the reason: nobody bothers to gather it. And so she went out and found a lot using social media. We also have a very interesting paper about the impact of visual representation of non-white people on young adult book covers. So, you know, among the population that we're with all the time, which are millennials, they're keenly interested in these things. And it's fabulous to have data that authorizes the industry to sink some resources into serving that population better.
I think that's great. It's surprising to me just to hear that, considering how many Hugo Award winners have been people of color, you know, over the last few years. And I mean, there are great strides being made somewhere. So, you know, it's up to us to be catching up. So that's fascinating. Folks, we have about 3 minutes left, so I definitely wanted to make sure I launched the last poll, but we don't have to end the conversation here if there are more questions you'd like to run. But if you will, just give me one moment to do that so folks can answer those questions. And then if you have any closing remarks, this would be a great time to gather those now.
Well, I'll add a couple housekeeping closing remarks. Sydney, thanks for capturing those questions. I'm going to turn the poll off my screen so I can continue to see everybody. There we go. And please do answer the poll for you, the nearly 200 who are still with us here. Kathi and Rachel, thanks so much. Gosh, I almost feel like this is just the tip of the iceberg, because every one of your slides with subgroups, we could have had groups from our attendants here talk about their different sections in breakout groups. And, you know, to our friends out there from across the industry, I'll be getting together with Kathi and Rachel and our OverDrive and BISG, ALA, the Independent Book Publishers Group. We're going to be talking about how we want to proceed with this, because I personally think, and this is not a commitment, there's an opportunity for a couple more gatherings here that could be focused on particular sectors, because we, again, each of you who raised questions on the chat or through the Q&A had different perspectives and maybe in slightly different professions. But in any regard, there's much more that we can do to take advantage of all the work that Kathi and Rachel have done. A couple other reminders. The website link was put up there. This is a free report. There's the executive version. There's the longer form that Rachel alluded to early on. And there's really valuable, the appendices with the survey questions and the methodology, and that gives you a lot more info about the exactly who were the 4,314 respondents and how they break down, and ultimately how this led to the findings stated by Kathi and Rachel. Those are available from the Panorama website. What I would like to ask everyone who remains here, many of you are already signed on to the Panorama site for email alerts, but as my colleagues mentioned earlier, we will gather all your questions. I'll work with the authors to make sure we answer accurately, but please sign up for email alerts. We won't inundate you from Panorama Project, but we want you, and as a couple of you mentioned in chat, you shared the report. That's like word of mouth in book recommendations. So I would ask that you, let's pay it forward. Let's push this report out to more of your colleagues in Omaha, Milwaukee, Seattle, Athens. I saw, we were from across the country. It's really gratifying. So please share it with your local colleagues and those you're networked with on LinkedIn and Twitter, and get more people to read some or all of it. And feel free to communicate, certainly with me, any of us, but Rachel and Kathi have 62 students that they're working to get their graduate degrees. They have a lot of other things going on. They've been in some great interviews with people in the media already, and we're going to continue to get the word out on this. So I'll stop because they got me fired up here. Thank you, everyone. Kathi, Rachel, any last words?
I do want to say thank you to the people who invested so much time to make this possible, because I do think this is groundbreaking research. We've only just begun to trace those connections between books and other media, and we can see that it's driving sales and driving excitement and acquiring new audiences. So thank you for this effort, because I think it's going to pay off for everybody, especially readers.
Yes, I would echo that. Thanks to all our funders and to Panorama.
Thanks, everyone. We'll let you get back to your day. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.